welcome. My name is Mildred. In this lesson, we are going to start using JavaScript on our class project. We are going to be working on the registration form for the client, and we are going to use a combination of all that we have learned. We are going to use events, we are going to use regular expression, and then we are going to use functions, and then we're going to try to apply all of this to our HTML form to validate the form. The first thing you have to understand, or the first thing that you have to take note of when you are trying to validate a form, is to take note of what fields are required. What should happen when a user skips those fields? What fields are optional? What error messages do you want to have? What are the criteria for the input value? Do you want all numbers? Do you want alphanumeric characters? Do you want any special characters in your field? These are the things you need to know before you start your validation on the field. Let's assume that we want first name and last name, unique ID, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, and date of birth to be required. We want middle name to be optional. So we want to do two types of validation here. First of all, if it is empty, we want the user to get an error message saying that this field must be filled. And then the second thing we want again is when it is filled in, we want to take that value and we want to tell the users that only letters and white spaces are allowed here. So knowing what we want to do, we will go to our HTML form and then we'll start designing. So on the form, we already have all of the input fields with their labels. We want to find out, or we want to create a place where this error message will be displayed when they are triggered. In the script folder, we have the validate personal info.js, and this is where we are going to write all of our JavaScript code for that page. And so we've added this to the page. In the head area, we have the validate personal info.js file here. I want to have a place here after the first name input field to display the error message. So I'll use a span tag. So we use span just like the div. It's just a container for text. When you want to apply style to a particular text, you wrap it within a span tag. So I want to apply style to just a text in a group of text or something like that. So we can use span to put the text. I want all of the error messages to be in the color red. And so I have specified a style for the span tag and put the text color to be red. And so I'll come back here and I'll put an ID attribute. And I want this ID to hold first name error like this. So in my JavaScript code, I'm going to refer to this span tag to be able to display error message for the first name here. The middle name is optional, so I don't need to do the same thing. The last name is required. So I'm going to copy this and put it here for the last name. And I'll change the error message to last name error like this. Then I'll do that for the unique ID. And I'll change this to unique ID error. So I'm giving a name that I can easily remember. So for the sex, I'll put here and I'll change that to sex error, and I'll do that for the gender identity and I'll call this gender identity error. I'll do that for the sexual orientation and I'll call this sexual orientation error. I'll do that for the date of birth and I'll call this DOB error. So when we refresh our page, we won't see any difference for now. All we've done is to create empty tags where we want to display our messages. And so we'll go to our JavaScript file. Now I've written some notes on this file, and in the previous lesson we looked at regular expression in the very basic form, and it is hard to explain regular expression without actually using it in validation for you to see how it is used. But I'm going to explain the different patterns as we use them. In JavaScript, and so far you have seen that when we have errors, it is not displayed on the page because we have not created any error handling. In JavaScript, we have try, catch, finally block like this. So let's say here, and here is going to be. You write all your code within the try block. When there's any error, the catch block handles the error and displays the error message. The finally block is a block of code that will execute regardless of the error or whatever happens between the try catch block. So if you want, once the catch displays an error message, it terminates the code because there's an error and it can't go further. But you can have a finally block that does something regardless of this result. We have a throw statements that we can use. For instance, we'll say if x is equal to 2, let's say throw x is illegal. So this just helps you to display an error message to the page instead of trying to say document or get element by ID, do this. So we'll definitely have an empty tag where this error message will be displayed. But we are going to look at how we use the throw and the finally as we do more examples. But for this lesson, we're going to be using just the try catch block like this. So this is the standard practice, that when you write your code, you write them within try catch block for error handling, and you use the throw to display custom messages. You don't want the system generated message like this. You want a custom message, you use the throw statement. So we are going to use the try catch for now, and we're going to see how this is done. We have finished creating our registration form. We have put tags where errors for each of the form field is going to be displayed. We want to now write a function in the JavaScript file. And whatever function we write, we want to use an event to call that function on this form. So let's create a function within the try block, and I'll call the function. Let me call this validate personal info like this. And within this function block, I'm going to do something. I'm also going to create more functions. I want this validate personal info to be called automatically when the form is submitted to check whether the inputs are empty or not. Then I want a function that validates each of the field based on their pattern. So let's say for the first name, I want to have a function called, let's say, validate first name like this. And I'll do that for the last name. So I'm going to do that for every of the field that has a regular expression pattern that I want. But so far, I only have a regular expression for first name and last name. And the rest of the field, I just want them to be required. So I'll create a function to validate the first name input, and a function to validate the last name input, and then a general function that is called automatically when the form is submitted to check if values are entered into the field and to get these values and use them to do something. In the earlier lessons of JavaScript, we have discussed how we create a variable and how we can use the document object model. In this lesson, we are going to use all of that. So the first thing we'll do is to create a variable. Let's say we're creating a variable called first name, and we want to get the value that the user has entered into the first name field on the form. We use documents.forms. You have to make your forms have a name. The name is personal info. So documents.forms.personalinfo. Now you've called the form, you want to call the input field name first name .firstname.value. So it is documents.forms.formname.inputfieldname.value. Now you've collected a value that the user entered into the first name field, and you have stored it into the variable called first name. We'll do the same thing for the middle name, for the last name, for all of the fields here. So we have for middle, for last, let's change this to let middle name be equal to the name is middle name. So verify the names that you have given your input field before you use them here. And the name here is last name. We have other input fields. Let's check them out. Let's see, we have first name, middle name, last name. Then we have sex. The name is sex. We have gender identity. The name is GI. So I'll do that here. So let sex be equal to this. Let gender identity. And then we have sexual orientation and date of birth, DOB, sexual orientation. So I'm going to put that here, sexual orientation. The name here is sexual orientation. And then we have date of birth. I'll change this to DOB. So we have collected all of the values entered into the input field, and we have stored them in a variable, and we've given the variable names that we can remember. The next thing we want to do is to check in all of these values, first name, last name, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, and date of birth are required field. So we want to say if not first name. So that means if the first name field is empty, we want to do something. The same thing, if not last name. If the last name field is empty, we want to do something. So I'm going to stop here. We are going to do that of the sex, gender identity, sexual orientation in the same pattern. So for the purpose of time, we're just going to do these two, and you see how it works. So if not first name, I want to say call the tag that has the ID of the error that is going to display the error for the first name. So I'll say document.getElement by ID, and I want to get the element with the ID of first name error .inner HTML. And what I want to do here is to say first name is required, and Once I say that, I want to make sure that the user is not able to leave the first name field until it is filled. So I can do something like document.forms.personalinfo.firstname. I'll use the focus method to keep the cursor focus on the first name and not leave there. And then I'll return false. I'll do the same thing for the last name, and I'll say last name error. I can even decide to use a break tag so that instead of displaying beside, it will display beneath, but we'll check that out soon. Let's try this out to see if it works first before we go further. So for us to apply these functions to the field, we want to first of all apply this function to the form. So now we have these scripts applied to the page, but we want to apply this to the form. And what we'll use is the onSubmit attribute like this. And what we want it to do is to return. We want it to return the validate personal info function like this. So let's see if this works. When we go to our page and we refresh, we try to submit the form, it will say first name is required. Because we've not entered the first name, it keeps focus here and first name is required. So it remains like this. So we can see that this works. So we can go further and continue working on this. So now we have done this and we have the required field constraint applied automatically when the form is submitted. But we want to do something when this form has a value. What do we want it to do? Once the value is entered, we want it to validate the value using a particular pattern. We said we want it to contain just letters and white spaces. Numbers are not allowed. Special characters are not allowed. So we want to define a pattern. Let's say let name pattern. And we want the name pattern to be, recall that we say we create pattern using // and within the / we write our pattern that we want to use. I want it to contain just the letters of the alphabet A to Z, lowercase, uppercase, and a white space character which we use \S for. I want it to search from, so I'll use a caret for the beginning and I'll say plus the $sign. So what this means is that when you use a caret, so I put a definition here for you to see. So when you use a caret, it matches the beginning of an input and the $sign matches the end of an input. When you use a plus sign, it matches one or more occurrence of the preceding character. And when you use an asterisk sign, it matches 0 or more occurrence of preceding character. So here we use the plus. I will change this to an asterisk like this. And we have our pattern for letters and white spaces. So the next thing we want to do, because let has a block scope or a function scope, we have to redefine first name again, because outside of the function, the first function, we don't know what the first name is. So say let first name is equal to document.forms.personalinfo.firstname.value. And we want to do something with this now. We want to say if first name, so if the first name has a value in it, we want to check this value now to match it, or want to test this value against the space, the name pattern. So we'll say let x, so let's put the pattern here as a test. So let x be equal to name pattern dot, we use the test method like this, and we're testing what? The first name. If x is equal to false, we want to do something. So if this fails the test, we want to say it should display a different error message. So we'll say document dot get element by ID. We want to get the element with the ID first name error. And we want to change the error message dot inner HTML, and we want to say first name can only contain letters and white. So let's break before we display this, so it displays beneath the field instead of beside it like this. And then we can do something else. We might want to say let's change the border of the input to green or to red. If we want, we can change it to red to show that this input has illegal values, or we can just leave it as we want to let it maintain the focus until the user enters what is correct based on the name pattern. So let it be focused. But if it is not, we want to say else. Let's change this. We'll make sure that this goes to empty if the values entered matches the pattern that is wanted. And then we want to change this document dot get elements by ID, or let's say document dot forms dot personal info dot first name dot, let's do the style dot border color, and we want the border color to be green, showing that this has the correct values that the first name wants. So once we do this, if all is well, this should work out well. I'm going to explain this again. Let's test it first to see that this is working. But before we can use this validate first name, we have to come to the first name field, and on the text input, we want to use an unblur so that as soon as the user enters something, we get the message immediately. And we want to return validate first name like this. I'll refresh my page. I'll try to enter names and numbers like this, and unblur is telling me first name can only contain letters and white spaces, and I can't move to the next field until I do something correct here. So when I put this and it's correct, it changes it to green. So that is what we did. So let's review it again so you can understand what I did. We tried to do two things. We took note of the required fields from the form, and we created a function that we called on submit on the form. And this function gets all of the values entered into the input field. And we say for the required field, if there's no value in them, we want to leave focus on that field, and we want to display a message between the inner HTML of a tag that has the different IDs for the different fields. So this function is called once we submit the form. And so we use on submit attribute on the form to return the validate personal info function. When there's a value in the first name field, we want to now call another function called validate fn. This function takes the pattern we want for the legal input for the first name field. It now takes the first name value and matches it against this test pattern. And if the pattern is false, that means if it violates this pattern, we want it to say, tell the user what he needs it to do, and maintain focus there. And if it's correct, it matches the pattern, then we want it to make sure the error message inner HTML becomes empty, and we want the border to be green. And we want this to happen every time focus leaves the first name field. So when it gets focus and the user types, and we use the unblur attribute, and we return the validate first name. So there are different ways to do this. We can actually use jQuery libraries for this, but this is how we use JavaScript for this. You can try and experiment, and you see shorter methods and different ways of doing the same thing. So this is all about form validations. I expect you to continue on and do that for middle name, last name, unique ID, sex. And so when this is selected, register, it will tell me last name is required because there's nothing in last name, and I put a validation as a required validation for the last name field here. So this is where we end this lesson. Thank you, and see you in the next lesson.